Okay, we are staying exactly in the same years as Ted has presented to us, but we are moving a bit northwestwards to the Netherlands, and I have to say that I was a bit surprised that I'm the only presenter concerning the Netherlands, because Netherlands are usually such a squeezed field of Jewish history. But nevertheless, I'm happy to be here and to bring you my sources. Before I would come with you to the sources, I'd like to say some words about the Netherlands in the 18th century, the city we are talking about, the Jewish group there, and of course about the manuscript where I got these sources from. The Netherlands in the second half of the 18th century were not that country that we remember from the 17th century. It was merely a shadow of its former self. It was strongly weakened by wars against France and against Great Britain, and in contrary to the 17th century, they turned out very well for the Netherlands. And in those years, in the second half, the state was under the rule of the quite incompetent Stadholder William V of Nassau-Orange. As I said, it wasn't any longer that we used to see that. It was no sea power anymore. Great Britain has overrun and overtaken this field completely, and also no important trade power that it used to be in the 17th century. And you can see a constant economic decline of that country in the 18th century. Now some words about the city. We are talking about The Hague, which is called in Dutch 's-Gravenhage, which is the official name, or half official Den Haag. And that was the residence of the stadholders of the Netherlands, and thus, in fact, the capital of the United Provinces, since the States General, the parliament, if you want so, and the complete political and military administration of the Republic functioned here. The Hague was by far smaller than the still rich and prosperous Amsterdam, which had then about 180,000 citizens, whereas The Hague was populated only with a bit more than 30,000, so it means a sixth of Amsterdam. But due to the status of the residence and capital, it was still an important city with a true urban character. I mean, 30,000 people in those days were a true city. The representatives of the provinces of the Netherlands on the one hand, and of course of foreign countries, molded the city and made it to an international stage with all the appropriate needs that it had to show. Because of the States General and the stadholders, also many soldiers and everything which was then connected to them could be found in town, and that will be important for our first source afterwards. We had also an opera house. Also this is important for the second source I've brought to you, which has been visited and mentioned, among others, by Giacomo Casanova, and he was a true expert for opera houses, and not only for opera houses, of course. And there was even a private opera house founded by Francisco Lopez de Lis in the first half of the 18th century, who was an extremely rich Sephardi Jew from The Hague, but it has been closed down in the 1740s. And as you probably or surely know, opera houses in those days were not what we are used to see today. Of course, you had the performances, you had the very famous ballets, you had music, but of course you had like gambling, eating, sitting around, chatting, and so on, and doing other things, whatever you can imagine. That means that the city of The Hague provided then the classical facilities for amusement in the style of the Rococo period. You had opera houses, you had, of course, pubs and inns, as every normal town, and you had an urban society and a garrison. And the best proof for this status is the fact, and the simple fact, that all the famous adventurers of the 18th century visited constantly The Hague, and they wouldn't have gone there if it was so boring. So you had, of course, Giacomo Casanova, he stayed there twice. You had the Count of Saint-Germain, who was probably also Jewish. You had the Chevalier de Geldern, who was surely Jewish, etc., and so forth. Some words about the Jewish communities in The Hague. Similar to Amsterdam, also there, we had two communities, the Sephardi group and the Ashkenazi. Also very like to Amsterdam, the Sephardi group was much older, much smaller, and much more wealthy and influential than the Ashkenazi community. The Ashkenazi congregation was officially founded in 1701 and was strongly determined by the Boas family. The Boas family was very important in the 18th century, especially because of Tobias Boas, who was a successful banker with excellent connections to the court of the stadholders in the Netherlands and to other European rulers, and he financed many of them. And he seemed to be, on the one hand, a very sophisticated leader of the Jewish community. He was, I think, for 30 years member of the Parnasim. He was a Parnas. And on the other hand, he hosted almost every famous adventurer in his time, all of them mentioning them. Casanova was hosted in the house of Tobias Boas, and so on and so forth, Count of Saint-Germain, Simon de Gelder, and so on. Probably because of the systematic influence of the Boas family, which had for more than 60 years always a representative among the Parnasim, that community was well organized in its administration during most decades of the 18th century. That brings me to the manuscript I am very happy to investigate. And this is the very, very impressive pinkas of the Ashkenazi congregation, which is most voluminous. And I have seen many pinkasim so far, but this is really the largest example I've ever seen, which contains more than 280 folio pages and many information about the community. Among hundreds of entries that you can find there, boring and more interesting ones, of course, there are the examples to be presented here today. Let me come to the first group of texts, and this is what you can find on folio 219, basically, and there are like two entries, 2.5 if you want so, and the third one on folio 244 is the second source I want to discuss later on. Let me come to the contents. The rabbi of the community, Shaul Halevi, who was related to the famous Amsterdam dynasty of Löwenstam rabbis, warned the community in his sermon held on Shabbat HaGadol in 1772 not to go on Shabbat to the Bos. What was the Bos? The Bos was a park area close or at the edge of the Hague, and even more important for our matter here, it was also the parade ground of the capital's garrison. The Bos was situated outside the Jewish quarter, of course, and also outside the Eruv. We had this discussion yesterday, and you mentioned also the Hague. I was happy to hear that. The boundaries of the Shabbat boundaries of the community. The rabbi had mentioned in his sermon the danger that someone could go to the Bos without noticing that he was carrying a watch with him, which would have been against the halachic prohibition of carrying objects outside the home of the Eruv or of the Eruv. Apparently, not all members of the community neither observed these laws any longer nor respected absolutely the authority of the rabbi and of the leaders. Otherwise, it would be unnecessary to mention that in a sermon on a very famous day in the communal life. Therefore, the Parnasim assembled together with the rabbi in his house on the first day after Passover 1772 in order to question a certain Michel ben Benjamin Haas, obviously a very young man, still unmarried, who had been seen the day before, a Shabbat, when he came out of the Bos carrying his watch with him. When the leaders asked him why he had desecrated the Shabbat by doing so and whether he wasn't remembering the words of the rabbi in his sermon, he answered that he did not do so by purpose. He also thought that carrying a watch wouldn't be against the laws. Michel also excused for not knowing the rabbi's admonition since he had not attended the service on Shabbat HaGadol. Probably he was in the Bos.
Well, he didn't say that he didn't attend the service. He said he didn't hear the sermon, which wouldn't have been during the service.
Okay. Yeah.
No, he was just sleeping.
He was probably sleeping. That excuse was less convincing, however, because on the one hand, the Jewish group in The Hague was not small, with about 500 individuals, but on the other hand, someone even knew or claimed to know that Michel had his watch with him when he came back from the boss. If one could know such a small detail, then the words of the rabbi on a very important Shabbat must have been a topic, I assume at least so, of conversation in the whole community. But the elders were officially convinced for this time, since they told Michel that his crime was worth a severe punishment, like excluding him from the prayer in the synagogue. But because of his excuse, and for not knowing the admonition of the rabbi, and also because it was the first time that he had been accused, the leaders let Michel go home unpunished. Probably the whole affair was rather created for warning the father of Michel, Benjamin Haas, who had had quarrels with the leaders some days before, and that source I didn't include here. The very reason for these quarrels between the father and the Parnasim remain unmentioned, but eventually Benjamin was accused that he would have cursed the Chazan and the Ne'eman, who both came to his house in order to bring him to the elders. The entry does not mention the reason for the hearing of Benjamin Haas, which is quite typical for Pinkasim, that they wouldn't bring us the unpleasant details of matters. Anyhow, in order to prevent further occurrences like that of the young Michel ben Benjamin Haas, the elders formulated an announcement to be read publicly in the synagogue, and this is the second paragraph you can find here in the sources. This announcement again forbade the walks to the boss on Shabbat, like some people had done in the course of the last year, in order to see the soldiers on the parade ground. And here I would like to cite the original text, or the translation at least, which says, "Some individuals did not abstain from going to the boss on last Holy Shabbat, and some of them have carried things from one place to the other, as they have admitted by themselves." We have actually only the case of the young guy who was walking, but they are trying to blow the whole situation and use the plural here. "This is, besides our many sins, a desecration of the Shabbat, and has happened last year, when a great misdemeanor occurred that had never been seen in Israel before, when some people, sons of the devil, had sedulously and deceitfully left the area of the Holy Shabbat. They did it in order to go to the ground where the soldiers drill, and seeing them, they would have been worth for being punished publicly, but being complete villains by excluding and expelling them. But for this time they only have been warned and have not been punished, because they have excused themselves with their ignorance." Permanent use of plural here. Very interesting. The public announcement doesn't mention anymore the issue of carrying objects outside the roof, but emphasizes the point of seeing the surely very colorful marching Dutch soldiers. That was obviously the main problem of the whole issue that started with desecrating the Shabbat. As we know from numerous other sources, the many possibilities to pass the time that were typical for the Rococo period not only attracted the Gentiles, but naturally also the Jews. Seeing the Dutch soldiers on the parade ground was, without doubt, an attractive possibility to pass the time on Shabbat, together with many other people, and presumably with many other young people, and also with many other young female people who came to see the soldiers as well. Especially when praying and Jewish learning could not convince anymore all the Jews that this was the only appropriate way of living. There's no doubt that the mentioned fact that Michel ben Benjamin Haas wasn't attending the service on Shabbat HaGadol has to be seen in that context too, if he wasn't asleep, as you mentioned before. The authority of the leaders was heavily damaged when 3 other family heads reported to the elders that they had seen Michel coming from the boss on Shabbat only 1 week after he had promised not to do so anymore. And this is the entry number 2 that you can find here in the sources. The elders, of course, could not let him get away with this and ordered him again to the assembly room, but instead of him, who appeared? His mother. She declared that it was true that he had been in the boss again, but this time he hadn't had a watch with him. Furthermore, she demanded not to judge him in the absence. Also, for that occurrence, there's no additional enclosing entry in the whole pinkas that would tell us the end of the matter. In case the leaders had insisted publicly in their position and had been successful, we would surely find such an entry with the report about the triumph of the tradition over the zeitgeist, which is of course my interpretation here. And concerning totally different cases, you can find it. The moment that the leaders reached the point they wanted to go, they wrote down a very long and sophisticated entry reporting about their will, which actually triumphed about the others.
Are there other cases involving this specific infraction? Or is this the only one you found?
This is the only one I found. In the pinkas, at least. Probably there are other documents, but I don't think so.
So he's, I mean, a kind of naive inference would be, he's the only one who's doing this. It's hard to believe.
I don't think so. Yeah, I think they want to make an example of him. And probably not because of him. He was doing like many others, I assume. But there was also, as I mentioned before, the quarrel with his father. And this is like, in German we say, du haust den Sack und meinst den Esel. You're hitting the sack, but you actually mean the donkey, you know. And I think this is the case here as well.
The problem here is not only that he's going out of the Arab, that's one issue. The Kunstlertum is a different thing. Which means, I don't know the geography of that. Hague, obviously.
I also actually noticed the change in language. The source here that you brought has both the record of the pinkas and then some kind of announcement that was made. Mm-hmm. And in the record, when the person who broke some rule describes what he did, he says, and I thought it was okay to leave the makom with my watch. And the makom that is a kind of neutral term. I guess he's probably talking about the Jewish area. In the hachraza of the community, when they're trying to keep people from doing just what he did, they call it michutz latchum, going out of the tchum. That language has halachic significance, but I might think that they're using it on purpose, even though it's clear that he didn't leave the tchum Shabbat. Tchum Shabbat is around a mile or so.
He's the expert, so it's helpful. In order for it to be the tchum, it would have to be
around a mile outside of the city boundary. It's clear that he...
Not necessarily. It could be an open area within the city beyond which there are residences.
Yes, but it seems like he's remaining in
Arab. You have a
urban
great ground. I don't know. Huge. I don't know. If they're going to
if in fact it's not, if in fact it isn't technically Tchum Shabbat that he's crossing, it's interesting that they're using a halachically charged term so that it's not just about Eruv, it's also about exiting a Tchum. But I suspect that in fact it doesn't actually have that halachic status, but they're trying to attribute it, kind of loading the language so that doing that kind of activity is...
I want to appeal to Stefan about the word Rococo in Dutch. Does it mean Amsterdam or could
yes.
it mean any city?
The first connotation, of course, is Amsterdam, but I think he's not referring to Amsterdam here, obviously.
No, he's not. But could the term have been used outside of Amsterdam at this point?
Yes, I think so. That they simply mean the place where I live, and still, Benjamin was not attending the synagogue very often, presumably, and the elders did so. They had to do so, and of course also the rabbi. And what you mentioned is really true. I could see it very, very often that in cases of quarrel between the leaders and individuals from the community, when it comes to a certain point, they are bringing in halakha. And that, you know, that beats everything. So they had discussions before, and they were like, no, I don't see your point. Okay, so we are bringing in halakha, and then you have to be silent.
So you have an instance of social control through defining of space.
Yes.
And then naming it.
Naming of the space, that's what I meant.
Mm-hmm. I see two other points here, and that is, and I didn't bring in yesterday, another source. I briefly spoke about it. The Hague itself, whether or not one needs an Eruv, was a big controversy in the 18th century.
Right.
18th century.
Right.
And so I could see that the rabbi here in 1772. Yeah, exactly. In 1770, they've concluded, we do need a neighbor, and the natural boundaries don't incline. In which case, it's a hot issue. That's why he's talking about the Shabbat Gadol.
Yeah.
And the other issue would be carrying a watch can be a gray area, in the halacha, depending on this or that interpretation. And once again,
we're not talking about this.
I understand that, but it's a tasha.
Right.
You see? And in fact, there are a number of 18th century, there are a number of early modern sources that would say they used to consider a watch, as we're speaking about over here, as an item that you couldn't carry in Shabbat because it wasn't an adornment of jewelry. And once again, on the other hand, the Kehillah here, the rabbi, whatever, could take the position, that it's not, that's incorrect, that one may not do so. In which case, carrying a watch outside of an Eruv would really be waving red flag in front of a bull in this particular time, this particular place. I don't know, but I suspect that's what's going on.
You're totally right that there was a huge discussion about the boundaries, and I remember that they found a definition by bridges and channels and so on, and I have to recheck that issue and to connect it to that. Totally right. So I've stopped at the point that there's no closing remark in the whole pinkas. Therefore, we may assume that also here the parties either came to a compromise, which has not been reported in the pinkas, or that the leaders had to accept tacitly the non-conformist behavior of Michael ben Benjamin Haas and maybe of several other young people. And you have many examples from other communities, like in Hamburg, or even at the Sephardi community in Amsterdam, where the Mahamad tried to stop the custom of several individuals to walk on Shabbat to the Dam, to go to the stock exchange, and for other purposes. Okay, so far the first group of sources, and now some words and sentences about the second source I've brought to you. It's dealing with Matatyahu, the Chazan of the community, and the Korei, Rabbi Benjamin. Chazan Matatyahu of Mosbach was in office since 1764. Before that, he was Chazan in Bayreuth, in Germany, which is also very typical that Jews moved in the 18th century from Germany to the Netherlands, and they were the largest group of Jewish migrators to the Netherlands. Also, Benjamin, the son of the former Chazan, was in office as Korei from 1764 onwards. Both of them worked, of course, closely together, and as it appears, also shared their spare time activities when they went together, at least occasionally, to the opera and to comedies in the Gentile theaters in The Hague. This custom was problematic because of their state within the community. Therefore, the leaders warned both of them not to do so anymore in 1779. When they would continue, they would have been excluded for 6 weeks from their office. So we agreed yesterday with Ted when we rechecked the source, because the formulation of the phraseology is not very clear here in that point. And for the second time, they would have been removed completely out of office. That would mean a loss of income, a loss of reputation, of course, and possibly also they would have been forced to leave the city and to look for another community, which was quite hard to do. So the whole phenomenon of, by the way, there is no mentioning of further visits in the opera house or theater in the pinkas. I don't know if they stopped or if they stopped reporting it. We cannot assume that. The whole phenomenon that I tried to describe here seemed to belong to the urban context in which the Jews lived. And that's why I gave you the explanation and the characteristics of The Hague in this period. Only in cities the Jews were exposed to the typical Gentile lifestyle of the 18th century, and some of them tried, of course, to copy it to a certain degree. Rural communities and their members did not have the same intensive contact to all the temptations of urban centers and were much more controlled socially due to their smallness, of course. In fact, the urban centers are the origins of cultural changes in every human society, and the Jewish communities were not different in this regard. We know about other communities like Hamburg or Amsterdam, as I mentioned before, where the leaders prohibited the visits in theaters on Shabbat as well as going to ball games, attending dance courses and carnival events. Both Eibeschütz and the famous Emden spoke against visits in theaters. Many rabbinical sources, in general, Shabbat is even worse. Many rabbinical sources speak directly against the leisure time activities of this period, like music lessons for men, hunting, card playing, secular studies, having pets, especially dogs, spins and carriage, and so on and so forth. This phenomenon was accompanied by the rejection of the traditional and ideal ascetic way of life that was then made as a center of Jewish imaginations. All that fits very much the deviances described by Azriel Schochat in his more or less famous book about German Jewry in the 18th century. And the Netherlands seemed not to be very different in this regard. On the opposite, because of the more liberal atmosphere in the Dutch Republic, there must have been a higher degree of assimilation and acculturation. Therefore, I think the phenomenon exceeded for sure the political borders that we can see in that era of any country, and further investigations, including, of course, Eastern Europe, would help to better understand general trends in Ashkenazi social history in the course of the 18th century and towards the Haskalah. And also, of course, concerning, to close the circle back to our topic here, concerning the constant look for new space of maneuver. Thank you.
I just want to raise one question. You said there were no other references to this kind of sin or problem, but the specific issue of going to the parade ground appears in 19th century literature as a very dangerous thing, because young men would go and then join the army. In other words, it was something where you were being attracted by something. Is there any possibility that that's relevant here?
I have to check that. It could be a certain way of thinking. I think there were no general restrictions for Jews joining the Dutch army. I've never read any article or research about the Jewish soldiers in the 18th century. I have no clue. But you cannot exclude anything.
I would say that the point of reference for Amsterdam is not any German city. The real point of reference is London. I mean, London Jewry and Dutch Jewry are the same Jewish community. And I'm not just talking about the Spartans. The same exact Jew. There's a tremendous amount of back and forth. And Amsterdam, even though its economy is shrinking, or at least not growing in the way that London's is in the 18th century, that's the natural point of comparison. It's always, and I think it's a mistake to see it, because, as you rightly say, Amsterdam is a real city. Berlin is not in many ways at this time. It's a small, over-glorified military barracks. But I'm saying in terms of the way in which Jews lead their lives, and that's what I think, that seems to be Amsterdam and London form one community. And it's not it's a Northern European or it's whatever. I just didn't say it.
Yeah,
so if you compare it to Berlin or to Frankfurt, that's not a good comparison.
No, I didn't do that. I compared it to Hamburg, which is much more beautiful.
Look across the channel.
Yes, okay.
I think the little exchange that happened just now between Magda and Adam was really important and overlooked by the community.
Okay, so
It wasn't out in the open.
They don't think
It
so.
needs to be outed. It needs to be outed because these texts do call into question what are the nature of the sexual sins, or what are the nature of the desecration of Shabbat? What is so unspeakable that people are being called sons of the devil, seditious and deceitful, and it's not being talked about? Why do young men go off into the woods and away from the community on Shabbat when people are looking? And so the exchange was, it isn't just the Jewish girls going off to look at the army. And Adam said, girls going off to look at the soldiers, and Magda said, why just girls? And I think she's right. And I think that in urban studies and in other studies, people need to pay attention, right, to the same sexual activity that's going on in cities that provides a great deal of matter for concern for the governors of who don't want to speak about it, but who want to find ways to prohibit it without mentioning it. So, that's interesting. You just didn't mention it. No, same sexual activity. Same sexual activity. Did everybody hear?
Well, this is the Netherlands where there had been that horrendous persecution of homosexual activity, of sodomitic activity, just a few years before this happened, when all these guys were being burnt at the stake, as far as I remember, just shortly before all this. So there may be a recent resonance. This has been happening right there.
I think it's actually everywhere all the time.
No, but the level of persecution is very unusual. In the 18th century, it's very unusual for people to be burnt at the stake for sodomitic activity in the 18th century, but it happened right in the Netherlands.
Right. But I just think it's so interesting that they use the euphemisms and that we then miss it. You know, if that's what's going on.
Yeah, I would just say that I think that I've heard from some of the texts that I've heard Joseph Kaplan cite, that these bombastic terms about the pursued by the devil, this is kind of a standard text. It's not to say that what Stefan is suggesting is not the case, it's just that we have to be careful in interpreting the language by contrast to other texts.
The term B'nai Belial doesn't really mean something. I mean, sons of the devil has the connotation in this kind of writing is people who do not accept authority. Yeah. That's the meaning of Belial. Belial. That's a rabbinic, that's what you find in literature. Which is a different thing altogether. It's not a question of evil, they're just not listening to the rules. Yeah, right.
How would you, if you were to take them and we could go back to the larger question of early modern, what would you see in these texts as early modern? Or is it already modern?
I think we are close to the borders, yes. And I think what is still early modern here is the attempt of the leaders to save their power, you know, and using like very bombastic phrases. And they try to do so frequently. I've brought to you only this example or two examples. There are like 20 examples in the pinkas where they try to again and again to put a border around the community that they would stay like good Jewish people. And I think on the other hand, what makes it a bit less early modern is the behavior of the young boy. And I think this is the cultural struggle that we have.
Is it because of the army parades that are becoming...
No, it's just the occasion. I mean, it could have been anything else. You know? It's not the army parades next week, it's like a ship parade.
So you think the transgressions are modern?
I think so.
Well, also seeing the city as a place of secular entertainment and having religious leaders, seeing that as a conflict with tradition is something that counted in the Counter-Reformation in cities. You see, the Catholic Church, trying to forbid people from going to certain types of secular plays and things. So that seems very early on to me.
But this business of prohibiting people from going to the opera or comedies is very interesting, and it really, the issue of whether it's early modern or modern is very complex, I think, because in Vienna in the middle of the 19th century, right, when Jews are certainly going to the opera, and that's even a good thing, right? Or at least it's part of the process of assimilation that is widespread. The cantor, or actually not the cantor, but his son, who is the director of the choir, is prohibited from singing in the opera. Or not singing in the opera, but singing opera in cafes and Weinstuben, in wine cellars and wine counters and so forth. And why is he prohibited? Is it because it will give the community a bad name if one of their own is, associating in wine cellars with slightly shaded characters? Is it lack of respectability, or is it mixing? What is the issue? This is in the 1850s. It's not.
I would give
respectability. It's a respectability issue.
Catholic director of
this was not a Catholic. This is Julius.
I understand. Would that be an inappropriate thing for a
church?
I don't know. That's a good question. That's right.
But I will give you a general example. My family is totally non-Jewish, but my father was warned in the 1950s to marry my mother because she is like an opera singer, and you know, those are dubious people.
So that's
forbid, you know? Yes, and I think it's the same.
There is another thing too. In the famous case that's been argued about in the literature, and I think it's fairly clear now, when De Rossi creates the music, the synagogue music, and we're talking now middle of the 17th century, and they publish that volume of his synagogue music. It originally, and Leo Modena writes an introduction to it, it was originally touted as an example of acculturation and so forth and so on. And then we got the point and said, wait a minute, it's only after they go into the ghetto that Jews are adopting this music. What do you mean this is a sign of assimilation and acculturation? But if you read the response clearly, what is fairly clear is there was no sin involved in the thing, because they're singing the music in the synagogue, and they're singing not High Holy Day, but holiday and Shabbat music. It is that form of music is considered inappropriate in the synagogue. So it's not just place, it's also an issue of a style of music. You know, that rock music, that's disgusting, it's immoral. It's a kind of a labeling of a kind of sound as immoral also. And so that's another element of what's going on.
That's probably also the threat that the cantor of by going to the opera house would probably bring in melodies that you heard there, and very simple.
I don't care if you go to
raise a couple of issues that to compare, and we'll discuss. I'd like to raise the issue of the pre-modern. In 1591, they were talking about in Krakow against Hilul Shabbat. I don't remember them all by heart, but if I remember correctly, they're very concerned there with economic issues that lead to Hilul Shabbat. This is more in the realm of the personal, but certainly an individual, and even two individuals at that, this happened last year, being Hilul Shabbat, is nothing new, not even in the medieval period. So I think in the question of modern, pre-modern, certainly, or medieval, there's something still to look at. But the question of using the tunes from the opera or from the theater is already in Sefer Hasidim, so we're back already in the late 12th, early 13th century. It gets picked up again in the Masat Benjamin, and Benjamin Slonik, and in Chuvas Levat, who also mentioned the question of using tunes, at least Masat Benjamin quotes Sefer Hasidim, and he talks about cantors using the tunes from the theater. Meaning that they hear the tunes elsewhere and they bring them in, and the question is that appropriate or not appropriate? So some of these issues have been reoccurring for quite a long time. So in terms of that, The Hague may not be that different than other communities, but I think that you're right in saying they're trying to hold on. They're beginning to feel...
Really modern is that it's happening in the Netherlands.
That's right. I think that...
Jewish community.
That's right.
The whole nature of the community is a different one because it sort of embeds itself in the early modern period. So it's a different.
Right.
It has to be seen.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the question of what's modern or early modern, in fact, does seem to be that theaters and operas are part of creations of public forms of entertainment. That is, most music and theater has been privately sponsored by aristocratic families, princely families. And the creation of what's called a popular, which Cass rightly saw as the beginnings of the creation of semi-neutral society, places that are neither Jewish or Christian, and assuming that these opportunities the Jews are going to fit into that kind of category. And so that is something that is very different. It's not just it wasn't just a question here of the inappropriateness of the art form, but it's also the mixing, and that's also involved in these kids, this guy going to the parade ground on Shabbat. If he'd been going to, it's hard to imagine something, an all-Jewish gathering of some sort, nobody would have had any problem, even if he didn't carry. I mean, it wouldn't have become such an issue. But it's a package deal, and it's both things are bad.
Do we want?
Just a question. Yes, the neutral space is a
is where we're getting into then the modern, with Katz's kind of definition. But I'm wondering if they're defining it differently. It's not that you're leaving the Jewish space and going to a Christian space. It's that it's something, if you want a Newtonian definition of space, he's going farther, thinking of Yom Gordon's L'mi ani amnel. How far will they go? So it's a matter of how much the distance is rather than crossing a particular boundary, although that term goes in. I'm wondering if his going out to an opera is different from his going out to a parade ground, and is different, and so that there is an attempt to use the traditional notions of Chum Shabbat, of carrying, but it really is, and there's at least a competing notion of space, and it might even be, I'm suggesting here, a Newtonian idea of space, where it's the distance rather than the fact of crossing a line.